They told me staying quiet would cost less than telling the truth, and that if I spoke up, I'd be the one paying for it. That was the logic my family had always lived by. Keep things smooth. Don't rock the boat. Don't embarrass anyone who matters more than you. I learned that rule early, and for most of my life, I followed it without even realizing I was doing it. The text came in at 6:42 a.m., right as I was standing in my kitchen waiting for the coffee maker to finish sputtering and clicking. The sun wasn't fully up yet, just that gray-blue light that makes everything look unfinished. I was barefoot on the cold tile, phone in one hand, mug in the other. The screen buzzed once. Then again. I already knew who it was. Hey, just a heads up. It's probably best if you don't come to the dinner on Friday. That was the first line. No greeting, no explanation, just a decision. Already made. I stared at the message while the coffee overflowed slightly, running down the side of the mug and pooling on the counter. I didn't wipe it up right away. I read the text again. It's not personal. The guest list is tight, and this crowd is different. I don't want things to be awkward. Different. That word had followed me my entire life, like a polite insult. Different meant inconvenient. Different meant not impressive. Different meant something you explained away before anyone asked questions. I typed back, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that too. Finally, I locked the phone and set it face down on the counter. The stove clock said 6:43. It didn't show seconds. It never had. I'd lived in that house for 4 years and somehow never noticed. Friday's dinner wasn't just any dinner. It was the night before my sister Caroline's engagement party, hosted at a private residence outside Philadelphia. Her fiancé's family was paying. Big house, long driveway, valet parking, even though it wasn't a wedding. The kind of event where everyone pretends it's casual while checking labels and last names. Caroline had been planning it for months. Not the food, not the seating, not the timing, just the impression. Who would be there? Who would see her? Who would remember the night and associate it with her name? I wasn't part of that picture. By 7:15, I was dressed and heading out the door, the text still sitting unanswered. The morning air was sharp, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine. My phone buzzed again. Mom agrees. Dad too. It's just better this way. That was the part that landed. Not hard exactly, more like something familiar sliding into place. Of course they agreed. They always did. Caroline decided what was better, and my parents supported it in the name of peace. That had been our family structure for as long as I could remember. Growing up, Caroline was the one who needed things. Attention, reassurance, applause. I was the one who figured things out. If something broke, I fixed it. If no one showed up, I stayed quiet. If there wasn't enough, I went without. My parents called me independent, like it was a compliment and not a requirement. When Caroline cried, people rushed in. When I stayed calm, people assumed I was fine. I drove to work on autopilot, stopping at the same red lights, taking the same turns. By the time I parked, I realized I hadn't responded. I hadn't even felt angry yet, just hollow, like something had been removed that I hadn't known I was still carrying. Around mid-morning, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. She left one anyway. "We love you," she said, like that explained everything. "This weekend is just complicated. We'll talk after." After was always where they put things they didn't want to deal with. At lunch, I sat at my desk and ate a salad I barely tasted. My coworker asked if I was doing anything fun over the weekend. I told her I had family plans. That wasn't exactly a lie. I did have family. They just didn't have me. By early afternoon, Caroline had already solved the problem of my absence. I found out because a mutual cousin texted me, confused. "Didn't know you were out of town. Everything okay?" Out of town. That was the story. Simple, clean. It explained why I wasn't there without raising questions. I imagined Caroline saying it with a shrug, maybe even a sympathetic smile. Poor thing, busy life, couldn't make it. I stared at the message longer than necessary, then typed back, "Yeah, all good." I hated how easy it was to play along. The rest of the day passed in pieces. Emails, meetings, small talk, the normal structure of a workday that didn't care what was happening in my personal life. By the time I got home, the sky was dark, and the house felt too quiet. I made pasta. I washed the same mug from the morning. The coffee stain was still there, faint but visible. I sat at the kitchen table and finally turned my phone face up. There was one more message from Caroline, sent an hour earlier. "Please don't make this a thing." I laughed once, out loud. It sounded strange in the empty room, as if I'd ever been the one who made things into anything. As if being erased didn't count as disruption, but reacting to it would. I didn't reply. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I opened my calendar instead and looked at Friday. Completely empty. That was when I realized something else. The dinner wasn't just the night before the engagement party. It was also the first time Caroline's future in-laws were meeting the extended family. First impressions. First stories. First versions of the truth. And by Friday night, the version of me they would know wouldn't be mine at all. When I was 8 years old, my parents forgot to pick me up from school on a Thursday in October. It wasn't dramatic. No panic, no tears, no police involvement. I sat on the concrete steps outside the building with my backpack at my feet while the sky dimmed and the after-school lights flicked on one by one. Teachers walked past, asked if someone was coming. I said yes, every time. Eventually, a janitor let me wait inside until my dad showed up nearly an hour late, irritated, like I'd inconvenienced him by still being there. Carolyn was at gymnastics practice. That was the reason. It always was. That was the first time I understood how our family worked, even if I didn't have words for it yet. Caroline's schedule bent the world around it. Mine was expected to bend quietly out of the way. She was 2 years younger than me, but somehow always felt older, louder, more certain of her place. She smiled easily. Teachers loved her. Neighbors remembered her name. When she walked into a room, she filled it without trying. When I walked into a room, people noticed if I stayed long enough. At birthday parties, Caroline blew out the candles while everyone counted down with her. At mine, my mom reminded me not to get icing on my dress. When relatives asked what we wanted to be when we grew up, Caroline said things that sounded impressive. Marketing, fashion, public relations, words that floated. When they turned to me, I said I didn't know. My dad laughed and said, "She's the practical one." That was supposed to be enough. By middle school, the pattern was set. Caroline needed rides, new clothes, encouragement. I needed less. That was how they framed it. I needed less attention, less money, less reassurance. They praised me for it. "You're so easy," my mom liked to say, usually when Caroline was crying in the next room about something that hadn't gone her way. When I got into a competitive summer program in high school, my parents forgot the deadline for the acceptance deposit. I covered it myself with money I'd been saving from babysitting. When Caroline wanted to join a traveling dance team the next year, my parents put it on a credit card without discussion. I learned early not to ask questions that would make people uncomfortable, not to bring up achievements unless directly prompted, not to correct assumptions. Silence became a habit, then a skill. In college, it got worse, not better. Caroline chose a private school she couldn't afford because it felt right. My parents helped her figure it out. Loans, payments, conversations I was never part of. I went to a public university 3 hours away because it made sense. No one helped me move in. I didn't ask. When I landed my first serious internship after graduation, my mother asked if it paid. When I said yes, she nodded and changed the subject. When Caroline took an unpaid position at a startup with a flashy name, my parents told everyone she was working in tech. They said it like it meant something. The strange part wasn't that they minimized me. It was how normal it felt. I didn't resent Caroline back then. I didn't even blame my parents. I assumed this was just how families sorted themselves. Some people needed more. Some people took up more space. Some people learned to live on the edges and call it independence. By the time Caroline met her fiancé, I was already used to being an afterthought. What I wasn't used to was being rewritten. It started small. A comment here. A vague description there. Caroline would tell people I was still figuring things out or between projects. If someone asked what I did, she answered before I could. She said it casually, like she was helping. "She's very private," she'd add, smiling. "You know how she is." I did know how I was, apparently. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to explain away. At first, I didn't push back. Old habits die hard. Then one night, about a year before the engagement, I overheard her on the phone at our parents' house. I was in the kitchen, refilling my glass of water. She was in the living room, pacing. "No, she's not coming," Caroline said, lowering her voice slightly. "It's just, she wouldn't fit in. Different stage of life." I froze by the sink. She kept talking, unaware. "She's fine, really. Just not very ambitious. She's always been like that." I didn't confront her. I finished my water and went upstairs like nothing had happened. I told myself it didn't matter what she said to people I'd never meet. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. But it mattered. Because every time she said it, it became more real, more solid. a version of me that existed without my consent. By the time the engagement happened, Caroline had been telling that story for a while. The story where she was the impressive one, the story where I was the soft contrast, the one you didn't need to invite to important things. When she announced the dinner, I wasn't surprised. I was surprised by how cleanly I was cut out of it. No long explanation, no awkward call. Just a message, sent early in the morning, like a scheduling note. I thought back to that October afternoon outside my elementary school, sitting on the steps, backpack zipped, waiting without complaining because I'd already learned that causing a scene wouldn't make anyone come faster. The difference now was that I wasn't 8 anymore, and I wasn't waiting to be picked up. What Caroline didn't know, what my parents didn't know, was that the version of me they were so comfortable dismissing no longer existed. They had stopped asking questions years ago. They had stopped paying attention. And in that quiet space, I had built something solid. They just hadn't bothered to look. By Friday, that was about to matter. The life I built without them wasn't flashy. It wasn't something you could explain in one sentence at a dinner party or summarize with a job title that made people nod politely. It was layered, slow, and demanding. It required patience and precision. It required showing up early and staying late, and taking responsibility for things that went wrong, even when they weren't entirely your fault. That was probably why my family never paid much attention to it. After college, I moved cities twice in 3 years. Not because I was lost, but because I was following opportunities that didn't announce themselves loudly. I took positions that came with steep learning curves and very little praise. I worked under people who didn't care if I was likable, only if I was prepared. I learned to read contracts closely, to listen more than I spoke, to notice what people avoided saying. I didn't talk about my work at family gatherings because no one ever asked the right questions. When they did ask, it was usually framed in a way that assumed the answer wouldn't be interesting. Still at that same job? Are you happy doing that? Does it pay the bills at least? So I gave them simple answers. Yes, yes, yes. What I didn't tell them was how often my phone rang after hours. How many decisions landed on my desk with real consequences attached. How many times I'd been the last person in the room signing off on something that couldn't be undone once it moved forward. I didn't tell them about the trust people placed in me, or how carefully I treated it. I didn't tell them because it didn't seem relevant to a family that had already decided who I was. Over time, I stopped correcting them altogether. The strange thing was that the more invisible I became at home, the more visible I became everywhere else. Colleagues started looping me into conversations early. Clients asked for me by name. My opinion carried weight in rooms where no one cared who my parents were or what my sister was doing with her life. I learned to separate those worlds completely. Family was one box, work was another. They didn't overlap, and I preferred it that way. It was cleaner, safer. Caroline, on the other hand, lived in the overlap. She curated everything: her social media, her career, her relationships. She knew how to tell a story that made her look like she was always one step ahead, even when she wasn't. Especially when she wasn't. When she got engaged, it felt less like a milestone and more like a campaign victory. The ring was photographed from every angle. The announcement was timed. The guest list was strategic. Her fiancé's background mattered more to her than she admitted, and everyone could tell. I watched from a distance, mostly silent. When I congratulated her, she sounded relieved, like she'd been worried I might complicate the narrative by existing in a way she couldn't control. That was when I realized something had shifted. Not in her, but in me. For the first time, I didn't feel small around her success. I felt detached, observant, like I was watching someone perform a role they'd rehearsed so long they'd forgotten why they wanted it in the first place. The dinner was supposed to be the final polish, the night where everything came together. Caroline had told me that much before she told me not to come. It was about setting the tone, about showing his family that she belonged. I understood that instinct. I'd spent years setting tones in my own life, just in quieter ways, making sure people knew what to expect from me, making sure expectations were met or exceeded. What Caroline didn't understand was that I wasn't a loose end. I wasn't a liability. I was simply an unknown variable to her, and unknowns scared her. By Thursday night, I'd accepted that I wouldn't be there, or at least, that's what I told myself. I made plans to work late. I cleared my Friday schedule. I told myself it didn't matter. Then something happened that Caroline couldn't have predicted, because she hadn't been paying attention for years. I got an email from someone I respected deeply. Someone who didn't know my sister, didn't know my family dynamics, didn't know I'd been quietly erased from an important event. The email was short and practical. "Are you free Friday evening? There's a dinner outside the city. I'd like you there." I read it twice. The location was familiar. Too familiar. I checked the address. Same town, same property, same night. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't fate either. It was the natural result of two worlds that had never overlapped, finally brushing against each other. I didn't respond right away. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling. I thought about Caroline's message, about my mother's voicemail, about the cousin who thought I'd gone out of town. I thought about how carefully Caroline had constructed a version of reality where I didn't need to be present, how she'd removed me not because I'd done anything wrong, but because she didn't know how to place me. The invitation sat in my inbox like a quiet challenge. I knew, in that moment, that if I went, things would change. Not explosively, not dramatically, but permanently. Truth has a way of doing that when it enters a room uninvited. I also knew that, if I didn't go, the story would continue without me, and I would once again be something Caroline explained away. I picked up my phone and finally replied to her message from the morning before. Understood. It was the last thing she would hear from me before Friday night. Then I opened the email and typed back a single word. Yes. If. I didn't feel angry when I sent it. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was calm, the kind that comes when you stop trying to be included and start deciding where you belong. Carolyn thought she was protecting her future by keeping me out of that room. She had no idea that room already knew my name. The first time I realized Caroline had been lying about me on purpose, it wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where everything clicked at once. It was a detail slipped into a conversation like it didn't matter. It happened the Sunday after she got engaged. We were at my parents' house, sitting around the kitchen island while my mother cut fruit she wouldn't eat, and my father scrolled through his phone pretending to listen. Caroline was talking about her fiancé's family, listing names, careers, connections. It was all very polished, very intentional. Someone asked about me. A distant aunt, I think. One of those relatives who only shows up for major events and still expects full updates. "And what about her?" she asked, nodding in my direction. "What's she doing now?" Caroline didn't even look at me when she answered. "Oh, she's kind of floating right now," she said lightly, still figuring things out. Floating. Like I didn't have an address. Like I wasn't sitting there. I waited for her to correct herself. To add something. Anything. She didn't. She reached for a strawberry and kept talking about wedding venues. I told myself it was easier this way. Less explaining, less comparison. That's what I always told myself. But once you notice a lie, you start seeing where it's been reinforced. Over the next few weeks, small things surfaced. A comment from my mother about how Caroline had told people I was not really settled. A message from a cousin asking if I was still job hopping. A friend of Caroline's congratulating her on being the successful one in the family, said like a joke, but not really. Each time, Caroline smiled. Each time, she let it stand. I didn't confront her, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be sure. Lies that matter tend to repeat themselves. They become consistent, useful, and Caroline was using mine. The dinner invitation confirmed it. By the time she told me not to come, she'd already decided how my absence would be explained. She didn't ask if I was busy. She didn't suggest another time. She didn't even pretend to feel bad. She just removed me from the equation and smoothed the edges. What I hadn't realized until then was how much she'd built on that version of me. Her fiancé's family valued appearances, stability, a certain kind of success that could be displayed and verified. Caroline knew that. She was good at reading rooms. She knew what impressed people and what raised questions. I raised questions. Not because I was unsuccessful, but because she couldn't summarize me in a way that made her look good. My life didn't fit neatly into her narrative, and rather than adjust the narrative, she adjusted me. Out of it. The proof came 2 days before the dinner, from a source Caroline never expected. One of her future in-laws reached out to me directly. Not to invite me. To clarify something. The message was polite. Careful. The kind of message people send when they're trying to confirm a detail without offending anyone. "Hi, this might be awkward, but Caroline mentioned you work in a temporary role. I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly." I read it slowly. Temporary. That was new. I didn't reply right away. I took a screenshot instead. Then I scrolled back through old messages, old group chats, old emails. Patterns emerged once I started looking for them. She's very low-key. She prefers to stay out of the spotlight. She's not really career-focused. Each phrase was harmless on its own. Together, they formed a picture that wasn't just inaccurate. It was strategic. Caroline wasn't just downplaying me. She was actively positioning herself above me by comparison. And it was working. I replied to the message carefully. I corrected the detail without drama. No accusations, no defensiveness, just facts. The response I got back was immediate, followed by a pause I could almost feel through the screen. "Oh," they wrote, "that's not how it was described." That was all. I closed my phone and sat back in my chair. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a car passed. Normal sounds, ordinary life. Something had shifted. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. For the first time, I understood that Caroline's behavior wasn't accidental or thoughtless. It was calculated. Not malicious in the way people imagine villains to be, but practical, efficient, self-serving. She needed me to be lesser so she could be more. The dinner wasn't about celebrating her engagement. It was about securing her position in a new hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, I didn't belong. What she didn't know was that lies don't just distort perception. They create vulnerabilities. Every false detail is something that can be tested, questioned, exposed. And she'd told enough of them that the structure she built was starting to wobble. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't rehearse confrontations. I didn't even feel the urge to correct her publicly. All I did was decide that I wouldn't protect her version of the truth anymore. Friday was coming. The room would be full of people who valued credibility, consistency, and substance. People who noticed discrepancies. People who asked follow-up questions. Caroline thought the risk was me being there. She never considered the risk of me not playing along. By the time she realized the difference, it would be too late to adjust the story. The invitation sat in my inbox for most of Thursday, without me touching it. I went about my day like everything was normal, even though it wasn't. I answered emails. I returned calls. I reviewed documents with the same focus I always did. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, I was aware of time in a way I usually wasn't, like I was counting down to something without meaning to. Late that afternoon, I finally reread the email carefully. The wording was straightforward, almost blunt. Dinner starts at 7. Casual but polished. Let me know if you have any dietary restrictions. No explanation, no context, just an assumption that I belong there. I checked the address again. Same property Caroline had mentioned weeks earlier, when she was still talking to me like I might be included. A restored estate on several acres, recently purchased by her fiancé's family. Old stone, long drive, the kind of place people describe as historic, even when it's been renovated beyond recognition. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. I thought about Caroline's face when she'd sent that message telling me not to come. Not angry, not cruel, just firm. As if she were setting a boundary that should have been obvious to both of us. I wondered how long she'd been planning it. How many conversations had happened without me? How many times my name had come up only to be dismissed with a convenient explanation? By early evening, I still hadn't responded. I made dinner at home, something simple, eating standing up at the counter like I often did when I was distracted. I barely tasted it. My phone sat nearby, face down, like it might vibrate on its own and make the decision for me. It didn't. Around 9, I got another message from Caroline. Short, almost cheerful. Just confirming you're good for this weekend. Everything's handled. Everything was handled. That was the phrase she used when she didn't want follow-up questions. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my calendar. Friday evening was still clear. No conflicts. No excuses. If I went, it would be because I chose to. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that room. To be seen by people who had been told a version of me that wasn't true. To let them reconcile that version with the one standing in front of them. It would be uncomfortable. Not for me necessarily, but for Caroline. For my parents. For anyone who had repeated her story without checking it, that discomfort wasn't my responsibility. I'd spent most of my life smoothing things over for other people. Making myself smaller so no one else felt challenged. Letting assumptions stand, because correcting them felt impolite. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about refusing to disappear on command. I replied to the invitation at 9:17 p.m. I'll be there. No emojis. No qualifiers. The response came back almost immediately. Great. Looking forward to it. I set the phone down and sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel excited. What I felt was steady, like I'd aligned myself with something solid after standing on uneven ground for too long. Friday morning arrived faster than I expected. I woke up before my alarm, the sky still dark. For a brief moment, I forgot what day it was. Then I remembered, and my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with awareness. I moved through the morning methodically. Shower, coffee, breakfast. I didn't finish. I chose my clothes carefully, not to impress, but to be accurate. Nothing dramatic, nothing that tried too hard. Just clean lines, neutral colors, shoes I could stand in without thinking about them. I checked my phone once before leaving. No new messages from Caroline. No calls from my parents. They thought the situation was settled. At work, I tied up loose ends and cleared my afternoon. A colleague asked if I had big plans that night. I said I had dinner. That was true. I didn't elaborate. As the day went on, I felt a strange sense of separation, like I was already halfway somewhere else. By the time I left the office, the city was starting to wind down. People heading home. Traffic easing. I drove out of town just before 6. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the light low and slanted. The road narrowed as I got closer to the address, houses giving way to trees and long stretches of quiet. When I turned onto the driveway, I slowed instinctively. The property was exactly as Caroline had described. Impressive without being warm. Manicured, intentional. I pulled up to the circular drive and parked where directed. No one questioned me. No one asked for my name. As I stepped out of the car, I took a breath and let it out slowly. Not to calm myself, but to mark the moment. Inside, voices carried from another room. Laughter, glasses clinking. The sound of people who believed they knew everyone who mattered. I adjusted my jacket and walked toward the entrance. Caroline had done everything she could to keep me out of that room. She had no idea how close I already was. I didn't rush inside. That was the first decision I made that night, and it was intentional. I stood just past the entryway, long enough to take in the space without being seen. The house smelled faintly of citrus and wood polish. Someone had gone to great effort to make it feel expensive without being obvious about it. Voices carried from the dining room, overlapping, confident. The cadence of people used to being listened to. I recognized my parents' voices almost immediately. My mother's laugh had a way of rising above a room when she wanted it to. My father's was quieter, timed carefully to land after someone else said something important. I took another step forward. A server passed me with a tray of drinks, nodded politely, and kept moving. No one stopped me. No one questioned why I was there. That was the second decision I noticed. I wasn't sneaking in. I wasn't hiding. I was simply walking where I'd been invited. I checked my phone. 6:58 p.m., 2 minutes early. Caroline always liked to be early. She liked to be seen arriving early, to establish herself before anyone else had a chance to fill the space. I wondered where she was standing now. Probably near the center of the room, angled just right, ring visible. I moved closer, my shoes quiet against the floor. The dining room opened up gradually, not all at once. First the edge of the table, then the backs of chairs, then faces. Conversations paused in small increments as people noticed movement. Caroline saw me last. I knew that because when she did, her expression changed so fast, it barely had time to settle into anything recognizable. It passed through confusion, then disbelief, then something sharper. Fear, maybe. Or calculation. She straightened instinctively, like posture alone might fix the situation. I didn't look at her. That was the third decision. Instead, I met the eyes of the man who had invited me. He was standing near the head of the table, mid-conversation, glass in hand. When he saw me, his face shifted into recognition, and then into a smile that reached his eyes. "You made it," he said, stepping forward. "Yes," I said. "Thanks for inviting me." The exchange was simple, normal. That was what made it dangerous. A few people turned fully toward us now. Introductions began to ripple outward. Names, titles, polite nods. Caroline stood frozen, her hand still resting on the back of a chair, like she'd been caught in the middle of adjusting it. My mother stared at me as if she were trying to decide whether I was actually there. My father's smile faltered, then reset. He glanced at Caroline, then back at me, like he was waiting for one of us to explain. I didn't. I took the seat that had been indicated to me, not the one next to my family, but across from them. That wasn't accidental either. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted them to see mine. The table filled in around us. Conversation resumed, slightly off balance, like a wheel that needed time to realign. Someone asked about the drive. Someone commented on the house. The usual warm-up lines. Caroline leaned toward me at one point, her voice low. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, smiling too hard for anyone watching. "I was invited," I said, just as quietly. Her fingers tightened on her glass. "This wasn't part of the plan." "I know," I said. That was all. The meal began. Courses arrived in careful sequence. Everything was timed. Everything was deliberate. Caroline tried to recover quickly. She laughed a little louder. She steered conversations back toward herself whenever she could. She introduced her fiancé again, emphasizing details she thought mattered. What she couldn't do was control what people noticed. People asked me questions, not invasive ones, curious ones. What brought me to the area? How I knew the host? What I was working on lately? I answered honestly, briefly. I didn't embellish. I didn't deflect. Each answer landed differently than Caroline expected. At one point, someone across the table tilted their head slightly and said, "That's interesting. Caroline mentioned you were still exploring options." There it was. I met their gaze, calm. "No," I said. "I've been in the same role for a while now." A pause. Small. Almost imperceptible. "Oh," they said. "I must have misunderstood." Caroline didn't speak. She reached for her water, took a sip, set it down a little too carefully. The conversation moved on, but something had changed. A crack had formed, thin but visible. The version of me Caroline had been presenting no longer matched the one sitting at the table. As the evening went on, the cracks widened. Someone referenced a project I'd been involved in. Someone else recognized my name from a meeting months earlier. Each time, I watched Caroline's expression tighten, then smooth, then tighten again. She was working hard. Too hard. At one point, my mother leaned toward me, her voice tight. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" she asked. "I didn't think I needed permission," I said. She nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was panic. The host raised a glass to make a toast. It was a generic one. Gratitude, family, new beginnings. Everyone lifted their glasses. As we drank, he added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm really glad you could make it," looking directly at me. "It's been too long since we've caught up." Caroline's glass froze halfway to the table. Too long. The word hung there, unchallenged. By the time dessert arrived, the room felt different. Not hostile, just alert. People were recalibrating, revising their assumptions in real time. That process was quiet, but it was thorough. I sat back in my chair, hands folded loosely in my lap, and let it happen. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't even corrected most of the lies. I had simply shown up, and Caroline was starting to understand that the story she'd been telling couldn't survive contact with reality. By the time the plates were cleared, the room had settled into a different rhythm. Conversations were still polite, still measured, but the ease Caroline had counted on was gone. People were paying attention now, not just to what was being said, but to who was saying it and how confidently. I noticed it first in the way questions were redirected. When Caroline tried to steer a discussion back toward her engagement plans, someone gently shifted it elsewhere. When she mentioned her upcoming move, another guest asked about timelines, then turned to me and asked how long I'd been managing projects on the East Coast. The pivot was smooth. Unintentional maybe, but effective. Caroline laughed at the wrong moments. She spoke a little too fast. She touched her ring more often than necessary. My father cleared his throat twice without saying anything. My mother smiled with her lips pressed together, her eyes darting between Caroline and me like she was watching a tennis match she hadn't meant to attend. I kept my posture relaxed. I didn't lean forward. I didn't retreat. I let my presence be unremarkable, in the way that only confidence can be. At one point, a man seated near the end of the table asked me how I knew the host. "We've worked together," I said. "In what capacity?" he asked. I answered. Plainly. Accurately. There was a brief silence, followed by a low, appreciative nod. "That explains it," he said. "Explains what, exactly?" Wasn't stated. It didn't need to be. Caroline jumped in quickly, her voice bright. "She's always been very focused," she said, like she was offering context. "Not really into the social side of things." I met her eyes then. "Just for a second. I like people," I said. "I just don't talk unless there's something to say." The table went quiet. Not uncomfortably so. Just enough. Someone laughed softly. Someone else took a sip of wine. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. After dinner, people began to stand, drifting toward the living room and the patio beyond. Groups reformed, less formally now. That was when the real conversations started, the ones without scripts. I found myself near the fireplace with two guests who had been mostly silent through dinner. They asked thoughtful questions. They listened. They didn't interrupt. Caroline hovered nearby, pretending to be engrossed in another conversation while clearly tracking mine. My mother approached cautiously. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Later," I said. It wasn't unkind. It was factual. She nodded, stepping back, as if she'd expected that answer. Across the room, Caroline was speaking animatedly to her fiancé, her hands moving in sharp gestures. He looked confused. Not upset, just confused. He glanced toward me once, then back at her, his brow furrowing slightly. I realized then that he hadn't known. Not really. Whatever version of me Caroline had given him, It hadn't included this. That wasn't my problem. The host clinked his glass lightly, calling for attention. Before everyone breaks off, he said, I want to thank you all for coming. It means a lot to us. He paused, then smiled in my direction. And I especially want to thank you, he said, for making the time. I know how demanding your schedule is. Every head turned. Caroline's face went still. I inclined my head, acknowledging the comment without making a show of it. That's impressive, someone said quietly. Caroline laughed too loudly. Oh, she exaggerates, she said quickly. She's very modest. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The room had shifted again, this time more decisively. People exchanged glances, small looks of recognition, the kind that say, we're adjusting our understanding. Caroline excused herself shortly after, heading toward the hallway with her phone in hand. I didn't follow her. I didn't watch her go. I stepped outside instead, onto the patio. The air was cool, the night quiet except for the murmur of voices drifting through open doors. The grounds were lit just enough to see the outlines of trees and stone paths. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and felt the tension drain from my shoulders. Not relief, just release. A few minutes later, my father joined me. He stood beside me without speaking, staring out into the dark. You should have told us, he said finally. I did, I replied. You didn't listen. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say that would fix this without admitting too much. Inside, voices rose briefly, then quieted. A door closed harder than necessary. Caroline emerged onto the patio moments later, her face tight, her eyes sharp. Why are you doing this? She asked, keeping her voice low. I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm just here. You knew what tonight was about, she said. You knew how important this was. I know, I said. That's why I came. She stared at me, searching for something. Anger, guilt, an apology she could work with. She didn't find it. You could have stayed away, she said. I did that for years, I said. It didn't seem to help. Her jaw clenched. She looked back toward the house, then at me again. You're embarrassing me, she said. I shook my head. No, I'm not. We stood there in silence, the gap between us finally visible for what it was. Not rivalry, not misunderstanding. Choice. She turned away without another word and went back inside. I stayed on the patio a moment longer, listening to the night. When I returned, the room felt settled in a way it hadn't before. The energy was calmer, more honest. Caroline kept her distance for the rest of the evening. So did my parents. People said their goodbyes. Coats were collected. Promises to reconnect were made, some sincere, some polite. As I reached the door, the host stopped me. I'm glad you came, he said. Some things are clearer when everyone's in the room. I smiled. They are. I walked out into the night without looking back. Behind me, Caroline was standing very still, surrounded by people who were starting to see her differently, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm again. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than lonely. For a few seconds, I lay there replaying fragments of the night before, not emotionally, just factually, like I was reviewing footage. Who said what? Who noticed what? Where the pauses had been. Nothing about it felt explosive in retrospect. There had been no shouting, no dramatic walkouts, no public accusations. And yet, I knew something irreversible had happened. My phone was already lit up. There were 3 missed calls from my mother, all within the same 20-minute window, starting just after midnight. 2 texts from my father. 1 long message from Caroline that I didn't open right away. I made coffee first. I stood at the counter and watched the steam rise, the same way I always did. Ordinary routines have a way of anchoring you when other people are unraveling. When I finally picked up my phone, I didn't start with Caroline. Instead, I opened an email that had come in late the night before, timestamped 11:47 p.m. Thank you again for coming, it read. I realized after you left that we've never formally acknowledged your role in the last review. I'd like to correct that. I read it slowly. The message was from the host, copied to 2 other people I recognized. People who mattered in the circles Caroline was trying to enter. The email was calm, professional, and precise. He referenced a project I had led the previous year, one Caroline had heard about only in passing, one she had described to others as a temporary consulting thing. In the email, it wasn't described that way. It outlined timelines, decisions, outcomes. It named me as the primary lead. It mentioned results that were publicly verifiable. It attached a document. I didn't respond right away. I saved the attachment and closed the app. That was the moment I understood what Caroline had miscalculated. She thought the risk was personal embarrassment. She thought the damage would be emotional. What she hadn't accounted for was documentation. The lies she'd told were casual, social lies, the kind that work in small groups where no one checks sources. But the world she was trying to enter didn't run on impressions. It ran on records. And records have a way of surfacing. By mid-morning, the messages escalated. My father left a voicemail asking me to call him back as soon as possible. My mother sent a text saying, "We need to clear up some misunderstandings." Caroline sent another message, shorter this time. "You blindsided me." I stared at that one for a long time. I hadn't blindsided her. I'd simply stopped stepping out of the way. I didn't reply. Instead, I got dressed and went about my day. I ran errands. I picked up groceries. I stopped by the dry cleaner. Normal life continued, even as my phone buzzed intermittently in my bag. Around noon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered it out of habit. "Hi," a woman said. "This is awkward, but I'm calling because of something that came up last night." I recognized her voice. She'd been at the dinner. She introduced herself, then paused. "I just wanted to apologize," she said. "I repeated something about you that I shouldn't have. I didn't realize it wasn't accurate." I thanked her. She sounded relieved. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting that sink in. This wasn't about vindication. It was about correction. The truth had entered the system, and now it was moving on its own. By early afternoon, Caroline's message changed tone. "Can we talk, please?" I didn't answer. I knew if I did, the conversation would turn into damage control. Explanations, justifications, a rush to smooth things over before they settled into something permanent. I wasn't interested in smoothing anything anymore. Instead, I opened my laptop and forwarded the email from the host to my parents. No commentary, no context, just the message. A few minutes later, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice sounded different this time. Unsteady. "We didn't know," she said. "We really didn't." That was the phrase they always used when something inconvenient surfaced. We didn't know. As if ignorance were an accident rather than a choice. Later that evening, Caroline finally called. Not texted, called. I answered. "What did you tell them?" she asked immediately. "I didn't tell anyone anything," I said. "That's not true," she said. "Everything's changed." I waited. "They're asking questions," she continued. "People are confused. They're acting like they don't know me." I pictured her pacing, phone pressed to her ear, the same way she used to when she was trying to regain control of a situation. "They're acting like they just found out who you are," I said. "That wasn't necessary," she snapped. "Neither was lying," I said. Silence stretched between us. "I was protecting you," she said finally. "You don't like attention." I laughed once. It surprised both of us. "You weren't protecting me," I said. "You were protecting yourself. That's not fair." "It's accurate," I said. She exhaled sharply. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to me?" "Yes," I said. "I do, because I'd lived it. For years. I need you to help fix this," she said. There it was, the shift, from accusation to request. "I didn't break it," I said. "I'm not fixing it." She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the attachment from the host's email. It was a formal report, cleanly written, thorough. My name appeared on the first page. I realized then that Caroline's mistake hadn't been underestimating me. It had been assuming the version of me she'd invented could override the one that existed on paper, because paper doesn't bend for family. And once it's in circulation, it doesn't go back into hiding. The questions didn't come all at once. They came in pieces, spaced out over the next few days, arriving from different directions, each one quiet on its own, but impossible to ignore when taken together. My parents invited me over on Sunday afternoon. Not for dinner, not for anything celebratory, just to talk. That word always meant they were uncomfortable and wanted resolution without admitting fault. I arrived on time. I didn't bring anything. My mother had already set out coffee and pastries, like she was hosting a meeting instead of facing her own behavior. My father sat at the table with his hands folded, staring at a spot just past my shoulder. Caroline wasn't there. "We need to understand what's going on," my mother said as soon as I sat down. I waited. "People are saying things," she continued. "Things that don't line up with what we thought." I took a sip of coffee. It tasted burnt. "What did you think?" I asked. She hesitated. My father shifted in his chair. "Well," my mother said carefully, "we thought you were still finding your footing." I nodded. "Because that's what Caroline told you." "She wouldn't lie to us," my father said automatically. I looked at him. Not angrily, just directly. "She did," I said. The word sat between us. Lie. Simple. Unavoidable. My mother pressed her lips together. Why wouldn't you correct her? I tried, I said. For years. You weren't interested. That's not true, she said quickly. Name one time you asked me about my work, I said. Just one. Silence. My father cleared his throat. We assumed if something was important, you'd bring it up. I leaned back in my chair. I did. You changed the subject. Neither of them argued that point. After a moment, my mother spoke again. Caroline says you embarrassed her. That you did it on purpose. I met her gaze. Did I say anything untrue? No, she admitted. Did I insult her? No. Did I ask anyone to question her version of events? She shook her head slowly. Then what I did, I said, was exist in the same room as her. My father rubbed his hands together. You have to understand how this looks. I almost smiled. That's the problem, I said. You care more about how it looks than what's true. They didn't deny it. Later that evening, Caroline finally came to my door. She didn't knock at first. She stood there for a long time before ringing the bell, like she was bracing herself. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. No makeup. Hair pulled back too tightly. She stepped inside without asking. They're furious with me, she said immediately. His family is questioning everything. I closed the door and turned to face her. Good, I said. She flinched. How can you say that? Because they're not questioning you because of me, I said. They're questioning you because they realized you lie when it benefits you. That's not fair, she said again. Like the phrase might work if she repeated it enough. I gestured toward the chair. Sit. She did. I didn't think it mattered, she said, her voice softer now. What I said about you. I didn't think it would ever come up. It mattered to me, I said. She looked down. I was scared. Of what? I asked. She hesitated. Then, quietly, of being compared to you. The admission hung there, fragile and exposed. I waited for something else. An apology. Accountability. Anything that acknowledged the years of quiet damage. Instead, she looked up at me with wet eyes. I need you to tell them it was a misunderstanding. There it was again. I shook my head. I'm not lying for you. It's not lying, she insisted. It's smoothing things over. That's lying, I said, just with better manners. Her face hardened. You're enjoying this. I didn't answer right away. No, I said finally. I'm done absorbing it. She stood abruptly. You always do this, she said. You act superior, like you're above all of it. I stayed seated. I'm not above it. I'm just not willing to carry it anymore. She stared at me, searching for leverage. Finding none. You're tearing the family apart, she said. I looked at her steadily. The family tore itself apart a long time ago. You just noticed because the damage reached you. She left without another word. Over the next week, the consequences settled in. Invitations Caroline had been counting on went quiet. Conversations shifted. People asked her direct questions she couldn't answer without contradicting herself. I heard about it secondhand. From my parents. From mutual acquaintances. I didn't ask for updates. One afternoon, my father called and said, her engagement might be postponed. I said nothing. She's devastated, he added. I know, I said. Can't you help her? He asked. I closed my eyes. I spent my whole life helping her, I said. This time I'm not stepping in. After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room, the light fading through the windows. I felt tired, but not guilty. The questions Caroline was facing now were the same ones she'd avoided asking about me for years. Who are you really? What have you built? Why did you feel the need to lie? They weren't my questions to answer. And for the first time, that truth felt lighter than any explanation I could have given. The cost came due quietly. No announcements, no confrontations, just doors that stopped opening the way Caroline expected them to. The first sign was the engagement party. It wasn't canceled exactly. It was reconsidered. The venue called it a scheduling conflict. The catering company suddenly needed confirmation again. A few guests sent polite messages saying they might not be able to make it after all. Caroline tried to explain it away at first. Bad timing. Busy season. People overcommitted. She said these things out loud like repetition might make them true. But then his parents stopped returning her calls. That was when the panic set in. My mother called me late one night, her voice thin and exhausted. She hasn't slept, she said. She's barely eating. She keeps replaying everything. I leaned against my kitchen counter, listening. They're asking her questions, my mother continued. About things she told them. About her past. About you. What is she saying? I asked. She doesn't know, my mother admitted. She's contradicting herself. I closed my eyes. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something closer to inevitability. People like Caroline survive on momentum. As long as the story keeps moving forward, no one stops to check the foundation. Once it stalls, everything gets examined. A few days later, Caroline showed up at my parents' house while I was there. She looked hollowed out, like someone who'd been holding tension in her body for too long. Her fiancé was with her, standing a step behind, hands in his pockets. He looked tired, not angry, disappointed. "I think we should all talk," my mother said quickly, ushering us into the living room like she was trying to stage an intervention. No one sat down right away. "I need you to explain something," he said to Caroline, his voice calm but firm. "Because I'm hearing different versions of the same story." Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it. "She told us," my father said carefully, "that your work situation was unstable." I looked at Caroline. She didn't meet my eyes. "Why?" her fiancé asked. "Why would you say that?" She swallowed. "I didn't think it mattered." He nodded slowly. "It matters to me." The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. "You told my parents she wasn't coming to the dinner because she was out of town," he continued. "Then they met her and realized that wasn't true." Caroline's hands twisted together. "I was trying to keep things simple." "That wasn't simple," he said. "That was misleading." I finally spoke. "You didn't just mislead them," I said. "You erased me." She flinched. "I didn't want comparisons," she said quietly. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Comparisons only matter when you're insecure," he said. That landed harder than anything I could have said. His parents arrived shortly after. Not planned, not invited. They walked in with the confidence of people who no longer trusted what they'd been told and were ready to verify it themselves. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. It was precise. They asked Caroline to clarify statements she'd made. Dates, details, descriptions. Each answer opened another inconsistency. Each inconsistency chipped away at the version of herself she'd been selling. No one raised their voice. When they turned to me, it was different. They asked what I did, how long I'd been doing it, who I worked with. I answered simply, I didn't embellish. I didn't defend myself. They nodded, took mental notes. "I wish we'd known sooner," his mother said. "So do I replied. By the end of the evening, the engagement wasn't officially off, but it was no longer secure. "We need time," his father said, standing. "Trust has to be rebuilt." Caroline broke down after they left. She cried openly, shoulders shaking, makeup smeared. My parents hovered, helpless. She looked at me through tears. "If you'd just stayed away." "No," I said gently. "This didn't happen because I showed up. It happened because the truth did." She stared at me. And for the first time, I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not remorse, recognition. The relationship ended 2 weeks later. Not with a fight, with a conversation. He told her he couldn't build a life with someone who curated reality instead of living in it. He said he needed honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. He said he didn't recognize the person she'd become. Caroline moved back in with my parents shortly after. Her social media went quiet. Invitations stopped coming. The momentum she'd relied on vanished, leaving her alone with herself. My parents tried to pull me back in. "She's learned her lesson," my mother said. "This has been hard on her." "I know," I said. "Can't you forgive her?" my father asked. I thought about it. "I can let go," I said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen." They didn't like that answer, but they didn't argue. Life went on. At work, nothing changed. Projects moved forward. Deadlines came and went. The stability of my days grounded me in a way family never had. One afternoon, I got a message from the host of the dinner. "Just wanted to let you know," he wrote. "Your name came up again today. In a good way." I smiled at that. Caroline paid her price not through humiliation, but through exposure. Not through punishment, but through consequence. She lost the future she'd tried to secure by diminishing someone else. And I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. I just had to stop disappearing. After everything settled, what surprised me most wasn't how quickly Caroline's life changed, but how slowly my parents adjusted to the new reality. They were used to crises that could be smoothed over with apologies and time. This one didn't work that way. There was nothing to smooth. The damage wasn't loud anymore. It was structural. Caroline stayed in her old bedroom at my parents' house, the one with the posters she'd never taken down and the dresser drawers that stuck. She slept late. She avoided people. When she did leave the house, she kept her head down, like she was trying not to be recognized in a town where recognition had always been her currency. My parents talked about her constantly. Her stress, her sadness, how unfair everything had been. They talked about her like she was the only one who had lost something. They rarely talked about me. When they did, it was tentative, careful, like they weren't sure what they were allowed to ask anymore. One Sunday afternoon, my mother invited me over again. Just me this time. She said she wanted to cook. That alone felt like an effort. We ate at the kitchen table, the same one where so many conversations had ended before they began. She served food she knew I liked, watched closely to see if I'd eat it. "I've been thinking a lot," she said finally. I waited. "I didn't realize how much we relied on Caroline to tell us things," she continued. "About you. About your life." I nodded. "You never asked me." She looked down at her plate. "You never pushed." "I didn't think I was allowed to," I said. That landed between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "We didn't mean to make you feel invisible," she said. "I know," I replied. "But intention doesn't erase impact." She sighed. "She's struggling." "I know," I said again. "She feels like everything was taken from her." I looked at my mother then. Really looked at her. "No," I said. "She feels like she can't control the story anymore." My mother didn't argue. A week later, Caroline asked to see me. She texted, not called. The message was short. "Can we talk? Just us." I agreed to meet her in a neutral place, a small cafe near the edge of town, somewhere neither of us had history. She arrived early. She looked tired. Not dramatic. Just worn down. We sat across from each other, a small table between us. She stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said. "I know," I replied. "I thought if I controlled things enough, everything would work out." "That's not control," I said. "That's avoidance." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." I waited. I'd learned not to fill silences for her. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for what I did to you." I believe she meant it, in that moment, but belief wasn't the same as trust. "I accept that you're sorry," I said. "That doesn't mean we go back to how things were." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know who I am without all of it." "That's something you'll have to figure out," I said. "I can't do it for you." She wiped her eyes. "Are we done?" I thought about that. "No," I said. "But we're different." She nodded, like she understood that was the best she was going to get. We left separately. After that, contact slowed. Messages became occasional. Updates filtered through my parents instead of coming directly. Caroline started therapy. She took a job she didn't brag about. She stayed mostly quiet. My parents tried, in their way. They asked questions now, real ones, sometimes too many, sometimes too late. I answered what I felt like answering. The difference was that I no longer felt obligated. I spent more time with people who knew me as I was, not as a supporting character in someone else's story. Friends who didn't need explanations. Colleagues who respected boundaries. A life that felt balanced in a way it never had before. One evening, months later, my father called. "We miss you," he said. "I know," I replied. "Will you come by for dinner next week?" "I'll think about it," I said. That was the truth. Hanging up, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even resentful. I was clear. Clarity does that. It strips away the need to prove, to argue, to be seen by people who don't know how to look. I had stopped trying to earn my place. And in doing so, I had finally chosen it. Life didn't reward me immediately after everything settled. There was no sudden promotion, no dramatic announcement, no moment where someone called to say, "You were right all along." What came instead was quieter, and somehow more lasting. A few weeks after my conversation with Caroline at the cafe, I was asked to take on a new responsibility at work. Not a title change, not a ceremony, just a conversation that started with, "We trust your judgment," and ended with, "This will change how things run." That was how most of the important things in my life happened. Without spectacle, without witnesses who needed convincing. The work expanded. The stakes grew. My name began appearing earlier in emails, not buried halfway down. When decisions were being discussed, people waited for my input before moving forward. Not because I demanded it, because it had become expected. I didn't tell my family right away. Not out of spite. Out of habit. Carolyn heard about it eventually, through my parents. She sent a short message. "That's big. Congrats." "Thanks," I replied. That was the entire exchange. Months passed. The seasons changed. The house where the dinner had taken place faded into memory, no longer charged with meaning. It became just another place I'd been, another room where the truth had finally been allowed to stand on its own. Caroline rebuilt, slowly. Not the way she'd planned, not publicly. She stopped performing. She stopped explaining. In some ways, she became more tolerable. In others, more distant. We spoke on holidays. occasionally in between. Polite, measured, there was no explosion. No reconciliation arc. Just two adults who shared history and little else. My parents adjusted too, though unevenly. They invited me more often, asked about my work, sometimes listened, sometimes didn't. I accepted what felt genuine and declined what felt obligatory. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating my presence. One afternoon, nearly a year after the dinner, I received an invitation. A real one. Not forwarded, not assumed, addressed to me directly. It was for a small event. Professional, private, a gathering of people I respected. People who had seen me work and wanted to know me better. I went. At that event, someone mentioned the dinner from the year before. Casually, without knowing its significance to me. That night changed a few things, they said, in a good way. I nodded. It did. They smiled. Some truths just take the right room. Driving home afterward, I thought about that. About rooms, about who controls them, about how often I'd been taught to believe I didn't belong in certain ones. The truth was, I had always belonged. I'd just been surrounded by people who needed me not to. I parked my car in my driveway and sat there for a moment. Engine off, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. The house was quiet, peaceful. My phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. "We're thinking of you." I read it. I didn't respond right away. I didn't feel pressured to. Inside, I made dinner. I ate at the table instead of standing. I cleaned up slowly. Later that night, I opened my laptop and reviewed notes for a meeting the next morning. As I worked, I felt something settle into place. Not pride, not triumph, stability. Caroline had feared being compared to me. She had feared losing status. She had feared being seen clearly. What she never understood was that the moment she pushed me out of that room was the moment I stopped needing anything from her at all. The collapse she'd been so desperate to avoid didn't destroy me. It freed me. Because everything I believed about my place in my family, my role, my value, it had already fallen apart long before that dinner. That night didn't end my story. It clarified it. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave.